Great. Well, hi, everybody. It looks like we've got almost everyone in from the waiting room. Thanks so much for joining us today on Zoom. My name is Lydia Webster, and I am the Assistant Curator at the Center for the Arts and Religion here at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And I am so delighted to welcome you all today to this afternoon's event, Poetry at the Edge of Belief. We're celebrating National Poetry Month. We just discovered for the fourth time in a row now with poet pastor Nate Klug and also Reverend Elizabeth Robinson. They're going to be offering us a reading and a discussion on the intersection of poetry and belief. So before I introduce our two poets, I just want to quickly let you know a little bit more about CARE and the work that we do here. There are two of us on staff here at CARE, myself and Dr. Elizabeth Pena, who's waving now. And we offer courses and workshops in the arts and religion, art exhibitions, events, and also grants for GTU students. So this semester we have two exhibitions for you, one online, Turning the Page, CARE Artists Look Towards the Future, and also a second exhibition which can be viewed from the ground floor window of the GTU North building in Berkeley. And I'll put the links to both of those in the chat box so you can learn a bit more about that if you like. So now to our two poets for this evening. First up, we have Elizabeth Robinson, who is the pastor of Orinda Community Church and also the author of 16 books. Most recently, Rumor from Free Verse Editions, and recently the winner of National Poetry Series for...
Not recently.
Oh, excuse me. So sorry. All right, well, a while ago, the winner of the National Poetry Series for Pure Descent, and also the Fence Modern Poets Prize for Apprehend. And her mixed genre meditation on ghosts was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award in Poetry. And then Nate Klug is the pastor of Arlington Community Church, and most recently the author of Hosts and Guests, published with Princeton University. And he has taught several courses and workshops on poetry for CARE over the years, and is also currently serving on the CARE board. So thank you to Elizabeth and Nate for guiding us through Poetry Month and offering us this way to join together through the arts over Zoom. And thank you to everyone else for joining us. So I'm going to hand it over now to Nate and Elizabeth, and I'll let you take it away. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Lydia, and welcome everybody. It's great to see so many folks, many familiar faces from church and poetry life. And I think we have a really special hour in store for you today. Like Lydia said, this is the fourth time I think that I've been part of celebrating National Poetry Month through the Center for Arts and Religion. And I'm especially excited this year to be joined by Elizabeth Robinson, who was a poet I had heard of and admired for a long, long time. And then just a year or two ago, was so excited to hear that she was coming back to California and was going to be near me and as a colleague of mine in the United Church of Christ, and really looking forward to this hour together. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by each just talking a little bit about how spirituality and poetry, writing and faith kind of intersect for each of us, sort of take you inside our own practices a little bit. Then Elizabeth has this really wonderful writing exercise that she's going to introduce as a way to get us all participating a little bit. And then we have a wonderful group of 5 or 6 poems that we're going to walk through as well. We're going to get to as many as we can. And all of these poems come from this wonderful book, which is sort of one of the guiding spirits of our hour today. It's called Quo Enema. Elizabeth, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that title, but I read it as sort of By What Spirit? And it's a book that Elizabeth edited. It came out a little while ago in 2019. And the subtitle is Innovation and Spirituality in Contemporary Women's Poetry. And it makes the really wonderful argument, I think, that women's American poetry in particular has been a sort of key source for interesting ways of thinking about faith, thinking about spirituality, and maybe in a sort of unrecognized way. So like I said, all the poets we're going to be looking at are all featured in this book, which I really encourage you to check out. So I'm just going to talk for like 2 more minutes now, just as a way of introducing our sort of topic about the way spirituality and poetry work together in my life. Then Elizabeth will jump in. For me, I actually came to poetry first. My mom is a poet, and so I grew up writing and became quite interested, quite serious about poetry when I was in college. And I only started going to church kind of towards the middle and end of college, and only started thinking about ministry a little while after that. So maybe sort of uniquely, I've had to negotiate the relationship of poetry and faith, not always as being complementary. I think often they've sort of felt like vying for priority, vying for primacy in my life. And I just wanted to lift up 2 quotes that really speak to me about that sort of tension that I feel sometimes. The first comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, where Jesus heals this boy, and then the boy's father says, "Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief." And the way in which a sort of feeling of faith is so closely linked with an awareness of doubt, and the sort of dialectic that faith and doubt share has been really, really important and generative for me, because really for me, writing poetry is a way of discovering. It's a way into uncertainty that might lend itself to a new feeling, a new connection with the divine. The other quote I just wanted to mention comes from a late letter from Emily Dickinson, and she says, "I work to drive the awe away, but awe impels the work." So maybe you can see that connection between that quote and the quote from Mark 9. Really interesting, right? The idea that Dickinson would be writing to get rid of awe, like to get it further from her, as if it were this force like fear, that's so powerful you can't stand to be in its presence for too long. But then at the end of that sentence, she says, "Yet awe impels the work." So awe sort of circles back in and provides this constant source. And at the most powerful moments of my writing life and my spiritual life, I feel that as well. Elizabeth, what about you? Talk to us a little bit about how faith and poetry fit together for you.
First, though, I want to say that my co-editor for Quo Enema is here. So Jennifer, wave your hands so people can. And that was a project of many years and much collaboration. And Jennifer, among many other gifts, is an amazing copy editor. And she wrote a killer essay about Brenda Hillman. So just so you know. I'm so excited that she's here among so many other people I know. I think as a child, I have a very different experience than Nate. One of the first texts that I had free reign to explore was the Bible. And I was reading it in a pretty context, instruction-free environment in the Baptist church, where the main instruction I got and the main imperative to faith was vast memorization. And I was so game for that memorization. I loved the feel of the language. I loved the King James. I love saying words like Habakkuk and Zephaniah and Jeremiah, and comprehension had very, very little to do with it. So I think that actually really informs my faith practice, that like Nate, though by a different avenue, there's a way of entering into belief completely uncomprehendingly. And I think the materiality of the language and the rhythms of the language, memorizing the Lord's Prayer, memorizing the books of the Bible, week after week after week, memorizing Bible verses became its own spiritual practice. And some people know this about me already, but my dad was a really avid reader, started reading to me when I was quite young. And he did not read, The Runaway Bunny. He read Gogol short stories and Chekhov short stories and Wilkie Collins novels. And I was tutored early on that Charles Dickinson, no, it's Wilkie Collins that I should be reading. So a lot of those had really elaborate Victorian locutions and very, very complex plot lines. Sometimes, for example, The Woman in White, which is a fantastic novel, is based on the idea of illegitimacy, which I didn't understand at all, and my dad never bothered to explain to me. It was clearly a pleasure for him to read that material out loud, and it was a great pleasure for me to hear it. And so I think that sense that there's ritual and presence in language is really what led me to poetry. Also room for not knowing, for doubt, for argument, and deeply, deeply for musicality of all kinds. So I think that is really essential, and also just the strange things that appear in the Bible. A man in a pit with lions that do not eat him, living water, burning bushes, seas that part. And I never had the first problem with whether it was literally true or not. I just knew it was beautiful and that it called to me. So early on, I was not a literalist, even though I was taught to be, but I was a great memorizer. And I think that kind of sets a context there. So I think also I would say the idea of the word made flesh was extremely powerful and still is, and that seems like the heart of poetry. To me, the idea that there's a disembodied presence that commingles with embodied things, and the idea of looking for the place where the name resides, which is somewhere in Deuteronomy, where the tribe is traveling through and they're looking for the place where the name resides, which to me makes it seem as though life and art are both processual, they are pilgrimages. You are always moving towards, never at a destination. So with that, let's play a little bit. And I think playing is also intrinsic to spirituality. And some people have done this with me before, I think in the OCC writers group, and also if you happen to have been in my surrealism class that I taught recently. But I think that the surrealist games are often really good ways of kind of opening the door. The surrealists were looking to open the door to the unconscious. And we are going to say, we're going to open the door to the spirit. So by random processes a little bit. So the first thing that I ask you to do is just to write down a question towards ultimate meaning. Like, what is death? Or how can I be saved? Or tell me what grace is. Anything that comes to your mind, but it should be done with some element of earnestness. Like you really want to know. So don't deliberate too long, and know that no matter what you write, it is the right thing to write. And I'm looking for my pen. Ooh. Okay. Do you have your questions? Bev says yes. Oh my goodness, there are many people from many parts of my life here. Hello, and to those I have not yet met. Okay. Now, not answering your own question, but answering somebody else's pressing question, give a response. And if you can, use an image in it. But if you can't use an image in it, then don't. But somebody is asking you somewhere in this planet something really important. So give an answer. One sentence. Okay. More people have come than I thought would come. So I think that it might be easier than calling on people, because some people have their screens blacked out also, if we use the chat box. So let's model this first. Nate, will you post on the chat box your question? He is typing. Okay, Madeline, would you write your response in the chat box? You're muted.
I can't use the chat box.
Okay.
Call
All
it
right.
someone else.
I will
Thank
ask the
you, though.
question. Can you verbalize the answer after I ask the question?
Yes.
Okay.
The
How do I
heart
know that it's really you, God?
Okay. My response to someone's question. The heart is a car I am cleaning of sin.
So there you have it. How do I know it's really you, God? The heart is a car that I am cleaning of sin. So, Bev, will you give us a question? You can type it or speak it.
Simply, what is my purpose?
What is my purpose? Robin Bradford, whom I haven't seen for many years, will you answer that?
Yes. The answer is grace is just sunlight on water, dear.
I think that suited Bev. So, what is my purpose? Grace is just sunlight on water, dear. Anybody want to volunteer a question? We have the oracle here, all amongst us. Lee. If you want to say it, unmute yourself.
Unmute. I say, what happens after I die?
Any respondents? Katrina, did you have a response?
We don't know now, but keep peeling back the petals slowly.
That was beautiful.
Love it. I love it.
It seemed to fit your question.
Yes, it did. So this could go on indefinitely. should we do one more?
Sure.
All right, who volunteers to give us a question?
I will.
Okay,
This is Anne. Can you hear me?
yeah.
What is it to be just?
What is it to be just? Who has a response? Is anybody volunteering? I can't see everybody all at once.
I have one, Karen.
Okay.
It is a mother holding her babe in her arms adoringly.
Uh, what is it to be just? It is a babe. It is a mother holding her babe in her arms adoringly. Ah, thank you.
That work, sort of.
That works.
Sure.
So I think that, you know, we had a spiritual journey at our church this weekend from a woman named Judy McCall, who's a musician. And she said what she likes about art is that it brings together things that don't match and makes a bigger whole. And so I think we can see that here and in the spirituality of the making.
I love that. Thanks so much, everybody. And thanks, Elizabeth, for that idea. Yeah, I so often don't feel like a poet. I don't feel any, creativity coursing through me. And exercises like these are really, really useful, I think, for everyone to just remind us, just to get us out of normal ways of using language, right? Normal ways of associating, and into seeing how much potential for strangeness and new meaning is just right there under the surface. So maybe that's a good lead in to looking at some poems. Does that sound good, Elizabeth?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And like I said, all these poets are featured in this anthology. And I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll look at. We're going to start with two poems by a poet who passed away pretty recently, Jean Valentine. So hopefully everybody can see that, right? Okay. And maybe I'll just go ahead and read this one. Luna Moth. Luna Moth at the black window. I hold you in my signal memory, but I can't get back to how to talk to you. Silent as the black window. Silent as your body. Little book on which I, in my hunger, wrote.
And I'm wondering, because her poems are so short and kind of peculiar, if it would be good to read the second one too, so people get a feel for Jean's work.
I think they go together well. So
Yeah.
yeah. Do you want to do that one, Elizabeth?
Sure.
Okay.
Trust me. Who did I write last night, leaning over this yellow pad here inside, making blue chicken tracks, 2 sets of blue footprints tracking out on a yellow ground, child's colors. Who am I, who wants so much to move like a fish through water, through life? Fish like to be underwater. Fish move through fish. Who are you? And trust me, said, there's another way to go. We'll go by the river which is frozen under the snow. My shining, your shining life draws close, draws closer. God fills us as a woman fills a pitcher. So I always think it's useful to start by having people just notice what they notice, like what seems strange or perplexing or beautiful or moving to you. in either of these.
There's too many people here to raise hands, so I think if you want to just speak up, I think
Yeah.
that'll work well.
I was going to say that I reacted to fish like being underwater.
Why did you like that, Lee?
I guess what it invited me to consider that there are more ways to look at things. Not everybody likes being underwater because it often, immediately means death to me. If you're underwater too long, you can't live. But the fish said, well, wait a minute, there's another way of looking at the joy of being underwater. And so it popped. My vision is difficult, so I didn't read it, I heard it.
Mhm.
And it just stuck right there.
It's like she's seeking a different way to be in the world.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. And it's another option.
Yeah. I would just say, for those who don't know Jean Valentine's work, that she, especially the longer she wrote, the more she tended to write very short poems, where she doesn't really reach necessarily conventional conclusions. She left a lot of open space. And I would say about either of these poems, if you were if you were in an MFA program and you presented them to the workshop, they'd probably trash you for jumping around so much, and like they would, you get in trouble. But I love that about her work, that she would make this huge leap from a moth on a window to a little book on which I, in my hunger, wrote, that completely moves me and is not logical. Or that she goes from making chicken scratches on the page to thinking about fish to talking about a woman filling a pitcher of water in a really short poem. She just seems so unafraid.
Mm. Mm. I love the way that that first sentence in this Trust Me poem, it's so clear and simple. Who did I write last night? But the first time I heard it, I imagined it being like, who did I write to last night, right? Addressing another. But then when you get to who am I, you start to wonder, maybe this I is the one who's being written in the first sentence. We talked about the power of uncertainty at the beginning, and there seems to be a real deep openness to like oneself still forming. And even if it's a late poem, that makes it even more moving, right? That this sort of radical uncertainty about who the speaker, who the poet actually is.
I also think that the capitalized "trust me" is so intriguing. Like, that seems to me to be an address to the divine, but you don't know anything else about the divine except that it's saying, trust me.
I'm very moved by the very basic questions. Who am I? Who did I write last night? I have a dear friend who's losing her short-term memory, and she asks questions like this. And she's deeply spiritual, and it all comes together for me. It's quite beautiful.
So beautiful, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, and then not just fish like to be underwater, but then she takes us down a river frozen under the snow, which, if that seems scary, and then my shining and your shining start to kind of connect with each other. I find that very powerful.
Mm.
Even though it ends, God feels us like a picture. But maybe that's enough
Yeah.
to meet underwater with just little shinings kind of touching one another.
Oh, well said.
Yeah, I love that.
Should we try another?
I'm struck by the imagery actually of this small book and a moth. I mean, I think of a small book as like a moth, like the pages, like that's, I
Ooh, I
can
like that.
draw those two together. Anyway,
Thanks.
That's
disparate
great.
things coming together.
Yeah. It's interesting that in both of them, she's talking about writing too. And I do equate that with her own spiritual inquiry, her hunger.
And in the part, she sort of has to be like a child too. Here I am back to children, but you know, she talks about children's colors, and then the way she says fish like to be in water, that sounds like a kid. You know, fish, it's real simple, but it sort of goes together for me.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
I loved the line that in the second poem that has trust me in it, because it just trust me is a being. I mean, it's a name of something, the way she's using it. And guess what trust me said? There's another way to go. I just in case we're ever stuck, trust me says there's another way to go. I just, like your friend up there whose sight is going, I heard that. I didn't read it. I heard it and I thought, who is trust me? Well, I don't know, but it's someone I'm supposed to trust. And there's another way to go. So I liked that so much.
Me too. That just grabs me about that poem.
It actually reminds me of the 17th century poet George Herbert, who will often put in, and this is something that lyric poets do a lot, like another voice comes into Herbert's poems all the time, and it often will be God's voice, but it often won't be totally explained, and it won't always solve the problem that the speaker's in, but it'll give a different option. It'll give a different way to go. And that's exactly what happens here at the end. And those last two couplets really are, you know, they're rhyming, they're so rich with tradition of English lyric poetry too, I feel like.
Yeah, the formal stuff she sort of sneaks in, you know.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like Pilgrim's Progress to me too. Like, trust me, you know, just another character. You said it could be God, but it could also be someone guiding the pilgrim. To me, that's how it came across.
Well, we'll keep thinking about Jean Valentine's poems, and maybe should we go on to this really interesting one, Elizabeth?
That's swell to read.
Well, you are released from discerning any words, Lee, because there are no words here. This is by Korean American poet Myung-Mi Kim, and it's from a book called Penury. And it's really, in a lot of ways, a book about grief. And the page, it is a poem. She attests to the fact that it is a poem, but it's just slash marks in a pattern on the page. Sometimes there's a period after the slash mark. So I'm sorry it's not a little bit more visually clear, but I'm just wondering what in the world you make of that. And how,
you have to beat out the rhythm or something.
Yeah.
yeah, I think there is really a rhythm to it. There are lines Mhm. There are pauses. I mean,
There are separations between
yeah,
slash mark traditionally, but
Yeah.
separations that are at once conjunctions.
And a chorus.
great point.
Mm.
Yeah.
And what's the first line? What word is that first line? That's the title. Reminds me of a code, you know, where you have to decode those puzzles in the newspaper. But
Yeah, I think it is. Elizabeth is saying John Cage, which makes a lot of sense.
This is Gary, and yes, John Cage would be one person to think about. Last night, Ann and I were watching this movie, The Sound of Metal, which is an Oscar nominee, about a very successful heavy metal drummer who goes deaf. And I was thinking of these marks on a beating on a drum and what it would be like. Just as I was also thinking when Lee made her comment about the struggle with vision, but her hearing took over. And this man's challenge in the movie, I won't give it away, but it's a similar kind of puzzle.
How does this become a poem for the reader?
Well, I think that Myung Kim, as with many of these poets, comes from an experimental tradition. And I think there's a strong tradition of the poet as the reader as a co-creator, so that the poet does their work, but the reader, by entering into it and interpreting it, is a co-creator, and that the meaning of it is not foreclosed. Like a text is an open text, which can be very frustrating to readers, but it can also be incredibly liberating. And for me, that also really works theologically, that we are co-creating with the divine. Personally, because I know that this book has a lot to do with grief, I think she's also pointing to when you reach what cannot be articulated, that there's something there that has urgency and needed to be expressed, but the usual limits of language just weren't subordinate to that need and that meaning. So we get a kind of a rhythm, a kind of a pattern, but there's a pressure of meaning and experience that doesn't always fit in language, even in poems. If that doesn't drive you too crazy.
You get there by being penurious.
Yeah, in some real sense, yeah.
Yeah, maybe you have to know penury or poverty or deprivation in some way to be able to stand this for a long time. Yeah, I think of Emily Dickinson's dashes, right? The way that she used those in her poems, of course, but then also in, little scraps and phrases she wrote on envelopes, in her letters. It became like her own kind of personal notation. And yeah, it seems like something similar is going on here. And David, I wonder if you could just repeat what you said.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was really full. You said these were kind of acts of closure that also presented an opening.
Yeah.
Something like that.
I said separations that were also conjunctions. that a slash is. I mean, ordinarily grammatically, comes between two things and really moves them usually into the same object that becomes an alternation between them.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. A really wonderful observation.
There's also a kind of scatteredness at the beginning of a broadening, widening, almost like an explosion of sorts when you're thinking of grief. And then a kind of a honing down towards some sort of stabilization, but not too clear, always a little tenuous, couple of repetitions, but there's sort of a drift quality to it, but a sort of a solidifying element as well.
Yeah.
To me, that I don't, it's a more of an emotional movie that you go through as your eyes scan down the page many, many times.
Yeah, I think
I
that's
don't know
great.
if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Does to me.
but then grief doesn't make much sense either most of the time.
Yeah. But I
Well,
think
it's
you're seeing visual meaning, you know, that it's almost pictorial in its pattern,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
which is really interesting.
It's getting the words down to their essence, down to bare bones. Or at
Even
least-
when there are no words.
yeah, that's what I mean, or the sobs or whatever it is, whatever the meaning is down to the essence.
Well, we could talk about this one more clearly. Thanks for suggesting this one, Elizabeth. Maybe we'll move on. We have a few more that we might try to get to. This is a slightly longer poem by a poet named Pam Ream. And I think she was the first poet I ever wrote a fan letter to. I was like maybe 18 or 19. And she wrote back, and I don't know if you ever corresponded with her, Elizabeth, but she has like really cool like stamps, and she sent me this just amazing letter that I still have. So I've always followed her work. Yeah.
I have some, and she was at Brown a little bit after I was, so we almost overlapped. So we corresponded.
Cool. So I think we're focusing on poets here who, and probably all good poets do this, but who really pay attention to aspects of language that are easily missed in everyday discourse. And I'm going to read this one and just invite you to pay attention to anagrams and words within words and how that kind of theme works throughout this poem. It's about 3 pages. And I think it's for her son, Nathaniel. A charm for sleep. Fear has an ear in it, and so it appears on all sides of night, laden with beasts. The hour when, the hour until, is the world's tribulation. To fall into history, to fall down a hole, to fall into the lion's jaws. So small the ear appears, and yet so laden with the night's hours. The road to be taken is most certainly a rod to be taken into one's own hands. A shepherd, you know, don't you, what the tiny foreleg holds? Your fear is an old snare. When concrete replaces nature, who can tell friend from foe? The road will appear leaden, the whole world's tribulation. Your hearing, a surrogate belief. My fondness for a lamb. When I was small, I held on to a psalm. My balm was a lamb, because night has a thing in it that cannot be calmed. To lie down and weep as the voice beacons, come and see. Sleep is a charmed mystery, a dreaded runaway embedded with vanishings. To ward something off, draw it, and it will pass away. Discourse with it, and it will lose its magnitude. You will lay yourself down uncaptured. Surely your soul will be kept, rescued in the sayings of this book. When rescue is secure, your reward is with you, and you are your own reward.
Yay.
Did anybody notice an anagram that stood out to them? Anagram sort of being one word that gets scrambled into another, right? I think there's some really interesting ones here.
Rescue is secure blew my mind. And I felt like an idiot that I had never noticed that the words have the same letters.
Balm and lamb, I just noticed.
Ward and draw.
I love that one
Yeah.
because it kind of enacts what it's talking about, right? That you can change something by representing it. Yeah. Night has a thing in it.
Oh.
And then fear and ear, of course. Yeah, so we talked about the childlike aspect of Jean Valentine's poems. And this is an interesting one to think about in that regard too. Interesting to think about it as a poem for a child, right? A poem that you might read to a child or sing to a child in the middle of a night terror, you know, or before they're, as you're trying to coax them to sleep. You know, and yet it's a poem full of a lot of the same mysteries or confusions that we've noticed, like in the Myung-Mi Kim poem. It's full of uncertainties and multiple meanings as well. So it's a kind of comfort, and I think it does comfort, but it doesn't do so via preconceived notions, I guess. Do you have any thoughts on this one, Elizabeth?
Well, in addition to the anagramming, just I feel like, yeah, she doesn't take away necessarily the menaces of night, but she charms it by repetition. The hour when, the hour until, to fall into, to fall down, to fall into, so small, so laden. And those are the kinds of things, you know, so it appears that, you know, like when my younger son was little, he would sit in my lap and cry and then force me to rock him by rocking his own body. And I feel like the language has some of that kind of rocking comfort in it by the repetitions. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the line too, you're hearing a surrogate belief. It reminds me of what you said at the beginning, Elizabeth, about your relationship with memorization and sounds. And that really resonates with me too, in terms of the way a poem often begins for me is through sound, you know, not through like, oh, I want to tell this story, though sometimes that happens too, but it's a string of sounds and you're like, whoa, you know, what is this going to lead to? And it's interesting to think about that as a surrogate belief, as a stand-in for belief. And of course, that's what the Protestants thought. Like Luther was emphatic that you had to hear God's word. You know, it came through preaching. That was, the auditory was like the main sense, kind of over and against the visual of the Catholic Church. So yeah, that's something interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Anybody else with a thought on this one?
I think older people have a hard time falling asleep, and you have to let go to sleep, or you have to have a, your age, young, you're busy when you're a mother, father, whatever, you can barely stay awake at night. You just fall, you have much to look forward to the next day. But when you're older, sometimes it's hard to go to sleep. So this is great. It'd be good to read, but anyway, I think it hits the old as well as the young, or anybody who can't sleep.
It reminds me of when I used to read Where's Waldo to my kids. Looking madly for their favorite thing, like the ear. I've been looking through the poem because I like that the ear keeps popping up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an adventure to go through this poem.
Doesn't it say the road is a rod?
Yeah.
That's a very emphatic statement of agency. It says we are participants in this journey. We don't just have to follow the road, perhaps where it leads us, passively.
Yeah, to be taken into our hands.
I especially love the ending, the last four phrases are, for me, heal the difficulty I had as a child reciting the "Now I lay me down to sleep" prayer. That was my childhood prayer that I was taught, that I recited every night. And now it's you will lay yourself down, uncaptured.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
And pray my soul the Lord to keep. Well, here your soul will be kept, rescued in the sayings.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that echo, Bev. That's really great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's terrific.
And you are your own reward. Wow. Wow.
That beats the heck out of "if I should die before I wake."
Yeah. You will lay yourself down uncaptured. The whole tone of this thing seems to be positive and uplifting in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there really is this hope at the end, but it feels earned, doesn't it? Because she doesn't shy away from the terrors of trying to get to sleep, but then also there's parts about history, when concrete replaces nature. So you get a sense of kind of hard looking at the way the world is too.
Mm-hmm.
It's terrific.
Yeah.
It's
gonna look it up.
Wonderful.
Can you tell us the name and the author again? The name of the poem and the author again?
Yeah, sure. Pam, how do you say her last name, Elizabeth? Is it Ream or Rem?
Ream, yeah.
Ream, yeah, Ream, yeah. And I think she lives in New York City still.
Yeah.
I think her husband went to seminary. Yeah. And then I think he got into the nonprofit world. Yeah, she said something really interesting in that one letter she wrote to me. It was something about church, because I think I might have said to her that I was going to divinity school, and she said something like I don't go to church, but I'm interested in it, or something like that. And yeah, I always wondered what that meant.
Better write her back.
I know. But yeah, the clearly interested in questions of the spirit and theology, like so many artists seem to sit right outside church. And I've thought about this a lot as a minister, how to kind of engage them, but without kind of breaking the shyness and the privacy of the position they've sought out. Because I think there's an integrity in that too. And not all poems work as Sunday church poems, right? We want more to work, and we want to, and we're doing that right now with today. But I think there's a real difference sometimes too. Want to respect that boundary. Speaking of the slashes, Elizabeth, should we do one more? I know it's almost 5. Do you have a thought on either of the last 2 that we might end with?
Well, if people aren't fatigued, I would say let's try the Kimberly Lyons one.
Yeah. Will you read this one for us?
Sure. Goodwill, Buffalo, New York. Is it the glassy, empty potential of the unfilled blouses, their prescient capability, flat as cataloged moths hung on racks, that require realization? A poem, for instance, pulls something thin over itself, a transparency with a weird fur collar, a skin of microscopic dirtiness. Or is it the soul comes to clothing already intricately made, seeks a garment, a white horsehair to enfold its deviation, pink as a petal, foldable as a Kleenex. It's raining outside the thrift store at night. My clothing is stained by strangers. The poem slips away through slots of lace, liquefied as a fat caterpillar dressed in the capsule of a cocoon. Anything you notice? I invite you to love this poem the way I do. But if you don't like it, that's interesting too.
It seems pretty advanced to me, Elizabeth. That's probably why you like it.
Can we get to the beginning of it?
Yeah. Yeah, the opening right off, the imagery of the moths on hangers. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that attracted me to this is that it's a very familiar scene to me, like a Goodwill and all the kind of slightly sad clothing, and that she sees something kind of spiritually rich in that and makes a whole kind of theology out of it. The unfilled blouses, their prescient capability. Is it them that requires realization? And then the idea that a poem pulls something thin over itself, or is it the soul that comes to clothing already intricately made?
Oh.
So I feel like she's trying out different questions. And then to end with the cocoon.
Yeah, that's such a great ending. The poem slips away through slots of lace, liquefied as a fat caterpillar, dressed in the capsule of a cocoon.
Oh my gosh.
That's it.
I think there's something about transformation there. I feel in a way this relates back to the Myung Kim poem in that we recognize there's something there, but it hasn't been clothed with language yet. And I think she's seeing a presence that's not yet clothed, but is still real.
Real. That was the word that came to me. She took the Hollywood out of the deal and bare bones it.
Yeah.
all the masks are off, all the fancy clothes. And we'll right down to the flatness of a caterpillar.
But also the soul and the poem can welcome things like weird fur collars and dirtiness and
Yeah. Well,
stains.
it's the non-conventional. That's what I mean by the Hollywood is taken out of it.
Yeah.
There's no show here. This is the real deal.
Well,
And I love the sort of suggested metaphor of goodwill, you know, and all these different items of clothing as a metaphor for like the words we use, you know. And so my clothing is stained by strangers. It's like, that's what language is, right? It's these words that come from the past and often, you know, sometimes have really ugly histories, but then how do we put them together to make something beautiful or meaningful? You can also read it in terms of like the doctrine of original sin and, you know, what do we do with this, this lack of fulfillment or, you know, imperfection that we inherit and now have to put on.
Yeah, I love also the seeks a garment, a white horsehair to enfold its deviation, pink as a petal. So she's sort of welcoming the deviation into the equation. I see that David has a really interesting comment too in the chat that the as in as a fat caterpillar seems ontological and comparative at once. There's this nice ambiguity.
yeah. The liquefied bothers me. I don't quite. It's sort of a weird image.
Yeah, it's weird.
Says a fat caterpillar. That's weird.
Yeah. Well, the weird fur collar and microscopic dirtiness, you know, that's all welcome here.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
It's not a butterfly, it's a moth. And it might be eating those clothes.
Yep. Cool.
Whoops.
Yeah. Well, this is maybe a good spot to end for today. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me and Elizabeth suggested most of these poems, really great choices. And again, this is the book, which I really recommend. I think it would open up a whole bunch of new voices to many people here. And thanks everybody for your comments. This is so fun to have like, however many, 30 plus people to talk about poetry. I haven't celebrated National Poetry Month as much as I need to, so this really it qualifies me for it. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. What a pleasure.
Yeah.
So great to see some of you I haven't seen for a while.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Nice to see you,
everyone,
Nate.
for joining us.
Thanks so much for being with us, everybody. Lydia or Elizabeth, do you want to say anything to close us out?
Me or Lydia or those
Lydia, go ahead.
No, I don't have anything to say.
No, me neither, except for thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And do be in touch for the next thing that CARE is going to offer. And thank you so much, Nate and Elizabeth, for offering us this fantastic art break, which I think we all really needed a little bit of something else to come and get together through poetry has been really, really fantastic. So thank you again for a wonderful afternoon, everyone. And
thank you all.
Thank you.
be well.
It was so much fun. Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Take care.